Imagine you are standing at a backyard grill on a warm summer evening. You have a fresh, thick cut of meat sizzling over white-hot coals. It looks perfect. It smells incredible. You have done this hundreds of times. You cook it, you sit down, and you eat. Now, ask yourself a question that feels absurdly simple at first glance. Why was that meat from a cow, a pig, or a chicken, and almost never from a lion, a wolf, a tiger, or a shark? We hunt animals, we farm animals, we eat animals. Human beings are, and always have been, opportunistic apex consumers. Yet, across every continent, across thousands of distinct cultures, and tens of thousands of years of human history, something stops us. Something specific, universal, and quietly absolute. The answer is not just culture. It is not just a social taboo. Beneath the surface lies a terrifying combination of ecological math, deadly bioaccumulation, hidden parasites, and a deep-seated evolutionary program embedded directly into your brain. Stay with me until the very end, because the final piece of this puzzle is not really about lions or wolves at all. It is about you and a hidden biological defense mechanism that kept your ancestors alive while others perished. Let us start with the most obvious question. Could you physically eat a lion or a tiger if you wanted to? Technically, yes. The muscle tissue of a carnivore is not inherently poisonous like a toxic mushroom or a pufferfish. If you carved a steak from a lion and cooked it thoroughly, you would not drop dead from a single bite. In fact, throughout history, starving humans, indigenous tribes, and big game hunters have consumed wolves, bears, and big cats. So the raw option exists. Yet, no human civilization in history ever built a stable farm, a marketplace, or a culinary tradition around farming and eating predators. Why? Because of a fundamental law of physics and biology called the 10% rule, or Raymond Lindemann's law of trophic efficiency. Every time energy moves up one level in the food chain, roughly 90% of that energy vanishes into thin air. Consider how this works in practice. Sunlight strikes a field of grass. The grass converts solar energy into chemical energy through photosynthesis. A deer comes along and grazes on that grass. But the deer does not store all the calories it consumes. Over 90% of those calories are burned just to keep the deer alive, beating its heart, running from predators, maintaining body temperature, and repairing cell damage. Only about 10% of that grass energy is actually converted into muscle and fat tissue. Now, enter the lion. The lion hunts and eats the deer. The exact same thermodynamic loss occurs. The lion burns through 90% of the deer's stored calories just staying alive, breathing, fighting, and hunting. By the time energy reaches the apex predator at the top of the food chain, you are literally dining on the leftover scraps of leftovers. To put this into terrifying economic perspective, a single adult lion needs to consume between 15 and 20 pounds of meat every single day to survive. Over the course of a year, one lion must consume thousands of pounds of herbivore meat, which itself required tens of thousands of pounds of vegetation to grow. If prehistoric humans had attempted to farm lions or wolves for food, it would have bankrupted their tribes within weeks. You would have to raise an entire forest of deer just to feed a small pack of lions, only to slaughter one lion for a fraction of the meat. The calorie math was an absolute nightmare. Hunting the deer directly cost exponentially less energy, carried vastly less physical danger, and yielded tenfold the energy payoff. Evolution favors efficiency, and eating predators was the ultimate thermodynamic mistake. Even if you ignored the energy math, a far more sinister danger sits hidden inside the tissue of every full-grown apex predator. It is an invisible biological trap known as biomagnification. Toxins, heavy metals, and persistent industrial pollutants enter the environment at the very bottom of the food web. Microscopic pollutants float in the ocean, and synthetic chemicals wash into rivers and soil. A tiny organism or microscopic plant absorbs a negligible trace amount of a toxic chemical. Mercury, lead, arsenic, or synthetic pesticides like DDT. That tiny dose is harmless to the small creature. However, a small fish eats thousands of those tiny organisms over its life. It cannot easily excrete or digest these toxins, so they lock into its fatty tissues. The toxin concentration begins to build up. Next, a medium-sized fish eats hundreds of those small fish. The toxin level concentrates again. Then, a large predatory fish, like a tuna, a swordfish, or a shark, eats hundreds of medium fish. By the time you reach the very top predator, the concentration of heavy metals and synthetic poisons is not just slightly higher. It can be hundreds of thousands, or even millions of times higher than it was in the surrounding water. This is not a theoretical model. It is a documented historical reality. In the 1960s, American biologist Charles Worster investigated mass die-offs of bald eagles near the Great Lakes. The eagles were not drinking pesticide directly. They were eating fish. But those fish had consumed smaller fish that fed on plankton exposed to DDT. By the time the chemical reached the top of the chain, the DDT levels inside the eagles were so concentrated that it broke down their calcium metabolism. Their eggshells became so paper thin that they crushed under the weight of the incubating mothers. This exact same phenomenon happens inside every land and marine predator alive today. Apex predators are biological accumulators. They spend 5, 10, or 20 years vacuuming up every trace toxin present in every single animal they have ever devoured. You already experience a mild version of this warning in modern life. Health organizations advise pregnant women and children to limit their consumption of apex marine predators like tuna, king mackerel, and shark due to high mercury levels. But now imagine eating an apex land predator, a grizzly bear, a wolf, or a mountain lion that sat at the summit of a terrestrial food chain for decades. The heavy metal load, synthetic chemical buildup, and metabolic waste inside that animal's tissue is staggering. In fact, human history contains a famous, horrifying lesson about what happens when humans eat top-tier predators. Consider the Arctic explorers of the 19th and early 20th centuries. During famous Antarctic and Arctic expeditions, stranded explorers, including members of Sir Douglas Mawson's Antarctic team in 1912, were forced to eat their sled dogs and Arctic apex predators like polar bears to survive. They cooked the meat and ate the organs, including the liver. Within hours, the men fell severely ill. Their skin began to peel off in large sheets from head to toe. Their hair fell out in clumps. They suffered from agonizing headaches, vomiting, double vision, liver damage, and eventually fell into fatal comas. What caused this nightmare? Polar bears sit at the absolute pinnacle of the Arctic marine food chain, eating thousands of seals that eat millions of fish. Because seals consume vast amounts of marine life rich in vitamin A, that vitamin A accumulates exponentially in the seal fat and ultimately ends up concentrated inside the polar bear's liver. A single gram of polar bear liver contains enough concentrated vitamin A to cause severe hypervitaminosis A, a toxic overdose that destroys human organs and causes your skin to detach from your body. The liver of an apex predator is quite literally a bioweapon engineered by trophic accumulation. Beyond toxic chemicals and deadly vitamin concentrations, apex carnivores carry another invisible threat that would terrify your immune system: deadly, specialized parasites. Herbivores like cows, sheep, and deer primarily eat grass and plants. While they carry their own parasites, their diet is relatively clean compared to carnivores. Apex predators, on the other hand, spend their entire lives eating raw, decaying flesh, blood, and intestines from wild prey. As a result, their bodies become living reservoirs for some of the most aggressive parasites on Earth. The most notorious example is a microscopic parasite called Trichinella spiralis. When a carnivore consumes infected flesh, the Trichinella larvae enter the stomach and mature in the intestines. They then reproduce and burrow through the intestinal walls directly into the bloodstream, migrating into the muscle tissue where they form calcified cysts. When a human eats undercooked meat from a predator, most commonly black bear, cougar, or wild boar, the human stomach acid dissolves the cysts, unleashing thousands of live larvae. They bore through your digestive tract, migrate through your tissue, and embed themselves into your tongue, eyes, heart, and skeletal muscles. The symptoms are horrific: excruciating muscle pain, high fever, facial swelling, respiratory failure, and death. Historically, every culture that occasionally hunted wild bears or wild cats learned one golden rule through hard, fatal experience: you must cook that meat until it is thoroughly scorched, or it will destroy you from the inside out. Now, let us address a simpler, more immediate reason: the flavor and physical texture of predator meat. Even if you manage to find a predator free of parasites and toxins, you would almost certainly hate the taste. Why does beef, pork, or chicken taste so tender, juicy, and rich? Herbivores spend their lives calmly digesting plant cellulose, storing smooth intramuscular fat, what chefs call marbling. This fat melts during cooking, providing richness and flavor. Predators, by contrast, live lives defined by intense physical exertion, acute stress, and constant fight-or-flight rushes of adrenaline. Their bodies consist almost entirely of dense, tough, stringy muscle fiber with almost zero intramuscular fat. Furthermore, carnivore muscle tissue contains exceptionally high concentrations of myoglobin, the iron-rich protein that transports oxygen to muscles during intense hunts. High myoglobin levels give predator meat an intense metallic, bitter, and intensely gamey taste that most humans find repulsive. In animals like sharks or certain scavengers, the problem is even worse. Sharks excrete urea, the primary chemical component of urine, directly into their muscle tissue to maintain osmotic balance in salt water. If you cook fresh shark meat without extensive chemical soaking, it smells and tastes overwhelmingly of pure ammonia. All of these factors, the thermodynamic loss, the heavy metal accumulation, the lethal toxic doses, the invasive parasites, and the foul taste, lead us to the most fascinating conclusion of all. How did our ancient human ancestors, who knew nothing about chemistry, heavy metals, vitamins, or microscopic parasites, manage to avoid eating apex predators for hundreds of thousands of years? They did it through an incredible evolutionary feature: the emotion of disgust. Psychologists, including Dr. Paul Rosen from the University of Pennsylvania, have spent decades studying the psychological architecture of human food choice and revulsion. What they discovered is remarkable. Humans possess a deep, near-universal psychological aversion to eating meat from pure carnivores. This reaction is not merely cultural learning passed down through schooling. It appears instinctively across geographically isolated cultures that have had zero historical contact with one another. When offered meat from a known carnivore versus meat from an herbivore, human beings, even young children, exhibit an immediate visceral gut reaction of disgust. Why? Because natural selection is a brutal, efficient teacher. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, early hominids who were reckless and ate apex predators often died young, killed by parasite infestations, heavy toxicity, or deadly infections. They did not survive long enough to pass on their genes. However, those ancient humans who carried a random genetic mutation, a psychological hardwiring that made the idea of eating a wolf, a big cat, or a vulture feel repulsively wrong, steered clear of apex meat. They stuck to the deer, the bison, and the wild ox. They survived, thrived, and raised children who shared that exact same instinctual aversion. That sensation of disgust you feel when imagining a steak cut from a lion or a hyena is not a modern social construct. It is an ancient living shield. It is the voice of millions of your ancestors speaking to you through your nervous system, protecting you from a biological minefield. When you walk through a modern supermarket today and look at the meat aisle, you are looking at the final result of this ancient evolutionary screening process. Every animal we have domesticated and put on our dinner plates, cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, turkeys, sits firmly at the bottom of the terrestrial food chain. They convert grass, grain, and seeds into clean, safe, highly efficient protein. They are easy to feed, low in bioaccumulated toxins, manageable in parasite control, and delicious to our taste buds. The top of the food chain was never meant to be our pantry. Apex predators were engineered by nature to act as ecological balancers, controlling herbivore populations and maintaining the health of entire ecosystems. They are not just animals. They are living, breathing archives of everything that exists below them in the food chain. Eating them means taking on the entire compressed biological burden of an ecosystem at once. Your ancestors figured this out without microscopes, without laboratories, and without written history. They passed that vital lesson down through the most powerful code evolution could write. They made it feel wrong. And the reason you are here today, watching this video, is because that code worked perfectly.